Edward Linley Sambourne, born in 1844, was a graphic artist that lived in Victorian London at 18 Stafford Terrace, together with his wife Marian and children Roy and Maud. For most of his life, he worked as the chief cartoonist for the satirical magazine Punch, and his work was shown regularly at the Royal Academy of Art. Linley's surviving diaries are filled with notes on his work and life, revealing that Linley was a man wedded to routine. At the same time, he strikes us as a humorous character, enjoying his creative profession and life to the utmost. Photography became an indispensable aid to produce his exquisite illustrations, and in this film we will explore why. Edward Linley Sambourne, for most of his life, illustrated for the highly influential and satirical magazine Punch. Deadlines were tight and constant. Weekly meetings on Wednesday were deciding on the content for the coming week of the magazine publication. From the beginning of the 1880s, Linley started working from photographs in aid for producing his cartoons. A very modern process that helped him a great deal in achieving his ambitious illustrations. The exact photographs would help him to study the position of the body of his models. As some of you might be familiar, nowadays we can see Edward Linley Sambourne's studio right on the top floor of Sambourne House. This would have not been there in the 1880s, as the same room was the nursery for Roy and Maud. Before that, he would have probably worked from both the drawing and the morning room of the house. Together with Shergill, we will talk photographic methods and experiment with photography as well today. Shergill is a photographic expert who has had his work acquired by the National Portrait Gallery, as well as shown at the Whitechapel Gallery, the V&A and Sotheby's London. I have had the pleasure to curate a more recent show in Los Angeles with works by Ram as well as work that we have created together. Hello Ram.
Hello Daen.
So tell us a bit, why do you think Linley's photography is so special?
Well, Linley Sambourne wasn't just a photographer, he was a genius photographer. He used photography as a method to create his beautiful illustrations, and I think many people don't really realise how good a photographer he was. The illustrations, they would be either traced around the image or that he would actually take inspiration from them. Because he was actually a draftsman. His background was, he was more technical.
And in fact, photography was a very new technology in the 1880s and shortly before that. So we can see that Linley was an avid lover of new technology. We can also see that in the diaries. So he, for example, notes that he walked all the way to a certain shop to have a look at the photo apparatus, as he would call it.
At that time as well, photography had become quite a bit of an objective scientific tool. What was really happening, lots of different photographers were around in London, and people would use them, even if you go back in history, he was used for science photography, anatomical photography as well. So Linley really thought of this as a new way, a novel science added to his work. So he was kind of a pioneer, I would say. Obviously, we look at the illustrations of him, he did his illustrations of Charles Darwin. He would devote many days and nights to his newfound love, which was the camera.
The photography would help Linley in actually achieving his very ambitious goals in terms of completing the illustration for Punch much quicker. And what was the process? Tell us a bit more about that, Ryan.
So he would take photographs of models. Sometimes he would use his groom, or his servants, and he would take these pictures, and they would wear quite theatrical costumes, sometimes hired from prop houses or costumiers, and he would photograph these shapes, these body shapes, and sometimes they were clothed and sometimes even unclothed. He would draw the body shape, the anatomy of the person, and then he would also add beautiful elements of nature, like butterflies or moths or plants even. We can see this in the water babies as well. How that was so eloquently and beautifully done. Also Linley's fantastic drawings from nature, where he would have ladies dressed in butterfly outfits, or quite anthropomorphic actually. Everything was quite anthropomorphic and zoomorphic.
So he sort of turned the dresses of women into shapes of bugs or butterflies.
Definitely. And with the hair as well.
Looking at the ways in which Linley Sambourne took selfies, so to speak, in order to do his drawings, has probably nothing to do with the 20th century or 21st century notion of taking a selfie for vanity or showing others, as Linley truly did use this as a method to arrive at his drawings and illustrations.
He was a true performer, and as we do perform for our images with our mobile phones and social media, in a way one could say that, it wasn't really a social media for him, but it was a way of him putting his media out into the world. What's quite interesting is the images that we see of Linley Sambourne posing for the camera. They're quite incredible because he's quite a performer. They're very, not just the costumes, he's very theatrical. Or the one where Linley's lying down on the floor and he's got what is he wearing? He's wearing like a kind of undergarment and his legs up in the air. They're quite comical.
I think it's supposed to be swimming, isn't it?
Swimming, yeah. So having those poses that he only in his mind would know, and how he wanted to draw them, it was almost he immersed himself in his illustration. He became the illustration in a way.
Linley's love for nature indeed reflects in the interiors of 18 Stafford Terrace, Sambourne House as well. And in an interview in 1893 for the Illustrated London News, Linley actually states, "You see, I don't believe in drawing out of my head, as people call it. I go to nature herself, and that must be better art than working from mere recollection. At least that is my opinion. I'm always on the lookout for people, objects and scenery to photograph with my beloved key camera." And this is indeed what Linley did. He went out and about and he photographed people on the beach, people on the street, and he sort of kept a little archive of these people as well as the objects that he photographed.
He used to have that large format camera, which was quite a cumbersome camera, which was quite large, and it would have a beautiful brass lens on the front of it, so it was made of wood. But however, it would be quite difficult to take outside. So the key camera enabled Linley to have more freedom as a photographer. He could go out, he could take pictures, and it wouldn't be so restrictive. And I think that was a turning point in photography as well at that particular time, that photographers began to have more freedom in going out. So it was a drastic development in the history of photography, having smaller and smaller cameras.
Definitely. And also the way that the sort of business side of things, the work life of Linley and his private life interwove was very tight. So it wasn't always to Marion's delight, because in her diaries she actually notes Linley at those everlasting photos, or also endless photography. So at the time, the house must have been bustling.
Well, it definitely was bustling at that time, because what was happening was, you can well imagine, I'm a photographer and I've worked having my own studio, and it gets very difficult because that live-work atmosphere is quite mad, because with models, and there would be friends, there would be people roped in to do the photos, to pose for Linley, and that would be quite difficult because props would be also taken from inside the house to taken outside. And I remember reading one of Marion's entries as well, saying that, the blustery wind is coming through, it's cold, So as the doors were opening, even the warmth of the house would be going outside, because this consistent removal of furniture in the studio, which was in the back garden.
So he actually, the main sort of area he photographed would be in the back garden.
Yes. Because
of the daylight. And sometimes he does complain about cloudy days as well, or rainy days, where obviously outside is difficult to photograph.
Yes, he would photograph in the garden because it has very good ambient light. When I've been to the garden, what's quite interesting about the architecture of the garden is there's that building in the back as well, so you don't get direct light, so you have a soft ethereal light, which is very good for capturing many types of lighting. However, when it is sunny, you do get those harsher shadows. And at that time, there was quite a lot of daylight ambient studios, as you can see going to Leighton House Museum, we have purpose-built daylight studios and the architectures of these artists' houses all over Kensington, which are still there today, historic buildings with huge daylight studios.
And also, it's probably likely that if you came to a calling at the Sambournes at the wrong time, you would have been taken into the back garden, perhaps to take photos as a certain character. So Linley notes in his diary as well that some of his callers came early or at the wrong time, and they were taken to be taken portraits of.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's one fantastic illustration that Linley did of all the Punch team having a drink with a pineapple sitting in the middle of the table. So this picture was actually, you go through the archives, you can see that each individual person's pose was photographed in Lynn's garden. So a single picture of a man having a drink or smoking a cigar or doing some weird act, then you would see them all conjoined in this one beautiful large illustration. So it was a great methodology for making his actual illustrations and engravings and prints.
And quite ambitious illustrations, making them happen.
Definitely. I mean, you only have to look around Sambourne House and to see every time you look again and again, there's another illustration that all stemmed from a photograph. So each illustration has actually got a skeleton of many photographs that made that illustration. Linley didn't really have his own darkroom. So what he did, he used the bathroom as a place to develop his prints. So he would get the negative, glass plate negative, which generally would be processed during the day, and then the negative would be dried, and then he would make a cyanotype print, which was originally a print used for people who used to make blueprints for architectural designs, or for draftsmen would use them as replica prints. It's a very quick and efficient way where you don't need many solutions. So you just need 2 solutions to make the actual paper coating, but he would get pre-coated paper already, because you can see many photographic boxes actually which have already pre-coated cyanotype paper, and that's got that beautiful texture. So you would get this paper and then you would expose it through sunlight.
So Linley did not always work from home. There is also the studio of Edwin Abbey, his friend, where he started photographing in the 1880s. And on 24th of February 1887, Lynn actually notes that he photoed model for Abbey, and later he adds in red ink, which is something that he would sometimes do, revisit his diaries to write in red ink. And he added in this case, saying, "Took first photographs from nude model ever done, Miss Wilkinson in Abbey's studio." And here we go. So he didn't always photograph from home. There's some other places where he also photographed, right?
Well, what's quite interesting, he started using professional models. I mean, some of these models, like the Pettigrew sisters and a few others, would model for artists such as Whistler and many other, high-profile artists. So what would happen was Lynn would be able to get the pose that he required much easier. So the pictures themselves didn't have that awkward disposition. They had this wonderful fluid type of painterly feel. And what was quite interesting, there was a big debate about photography and painting. Where does one get the inspiration from? I mean, obviously we have, as we were talking about Lord Leighton, and many artists wouldn't maybe think of using photography as a method for their paintings.
Also, the fact that artists studied the nude, it was something that was for a long time reserved for male artists.
Yeah.
So we have a caricature there of Horsley as well. This sort of ridicules the situation that nude models would sometimes be seen as something not to be talked about. However, for artists, that was something to study in order to study the body with and without drapery, which would be called draperie mouillée.
A lot of the sculptures and the art that Linley collected in the house, you could see that subconsciously or consciously that Linley Sambourne actually took that for an inspiration. And the discussion of photography and painting was quite a challenging discussion, because for many years, from the 16th and 17th centuries, people were all using the big box, as we mentioned before, a form of that, the camera obscura, which was almost like a pinhole type of camera where it would reflect the image upside down on a large surface. And a lot of painters, even Vermeer and many painters would use this method to paint their pictures, like they would trace around the pictures. But Lin went a bit further. He didn't just use a camera obscura, he actually took the photograph.
So as you can imagine, it mustn't have always been easy to work from home with children running about and everything happening there in terms of private life as well. So in fact, one day in August in 1887 seems to have been quite anticlimactic, where Linley notes in his diary, fine morning, worked on photo of self, but later on he writes, Roy naughty, spoiled plate. Then March 23rd, developed a lot of plates, found out the reason for fogging, light at back. So Ram, what can go wrong with photography?
So much can go wrong. I think when you have many children running around the house and you're working with glass plate negatives, there can be lots of mishaps and accidents that can happen. One of the main things that I find that could have potentially gone wrong when there was photographs, or if the negatives weren't as punchy, as we call it in the industry, was mainly due to the bellows, light leaking through the bellows of the camera. And that can quite easily happen if the bellows are not actually attacked. And what the bellows are like a concertina type of attachment from the bases of the wood of the camera. So many things like that could happen. And also, film fogging, paper being left out for too long.
When we look at photographic methods before the cyanotype came about, there was also the technique of wet plate.
Yes, so wet plate, it was a way of deciphering who were the professionals and who were the amateurs. Amateur photographers were not really known so much, because doing wet plate was a very laborious task. It was almost to the point where you had to be very scientific, you'd have to be very accurate, lots of precision that has to be taken. I mean, we had our portrait done with a very good photographer, friend of ours, Magda Kusa, and that was quite a long process just to get 4 or even 2 pictures. Took a whole day to get that, and she has all the modern equipment. But having said that, so when Linley started with the dry plate, because that became in vogue, so it opened itself up. Opened photography up to a whole new sector of people who could actually use it. So the professionals weren't only the people who could do photography. So it opened itself up to the everyday person could potentially be a photographer.
We are recreating the process of producing cyanotypes just like the ones that Linley Sambourne would have produced during his lifetime in order to draw his wonderful illustrations. That said, Linley often used pre-coated photographic paper, but we decided to coat our own. In order to do so, we need a porous paper of a high grammage, which gives the whole process a wonderful art feeling. In order to mix our solution, we need 2 parts. Part A is potassium ferrocyanide and part B ammonium citrate. We are armed with gloves and protective wear because especially in the 1800s, this process needed extra care. A lot of the time, the chemicals were in powder form and would also contain toxic substances. When handling these liquids and mixing them, we need to be exact with the measurement, and we need to make sure these are mixed properly before mixing the 2 together. can see here the liquids are mixed together. For this purpose we have only mixed a small amount. After that we take our wonderfully soft brush and we then coat the paper once. The paper after that is left to dry in a dark room or closet, and the coating process can also be repeated up to 3 times. We are leaving our coated paper for just about half an hour to dry. Now we need the negative that Linley would have used as well. This is one of the examples of his own negatives that we found in his studio at Sambourne House. In our case, we are using negatives from a Type 55 film, which was photographed on a 5x4 camera, and which is not glass as Linley's negatives would have been. We need to dust the negative in order to make sure any unwanted dust particles are not on the picture anymore. And then we are placing the negative on top of the paper directly, after which this is placed underneath glass. We do need to remember that the exposure will take place directly from the point when we are taking the paper out of the closet. Once the negative and paper are placed underneath glass and exposed to the sunlight or light, this can take minutes up to hours depending on the light condition. The strength of the blue depends on the strength of the ambient UV rays, and here we can see how the color changes from the yellow-green to the dark blue. After we think the exposure is done, we can take the image and we can remove the negative. We are now rinsing the image with fresh water for about 5 minutes, which can also be sped up by adding vinegar to the water. And as we can see here, the image does not come out with such a high contrast. Even though this is such a simple process in theory, there are many factors to consider, including the density of the negative, the contrast of the image that is photographed and displayed on the negative, the paper thickness, how many coats we apply to the paper, and how long this is exposed to light. In our case, we decided that this outcome did not quite meet our expectations, simply because the image seemed a bit washed out. We then tried again, and we used a couple of different negatives at the same time, going through the same process that we have just shown. After a couple of hours, in this case actually the next day, we removed the prints from their case underneath the glass, and we were surprised to see that they had darkened quite a lot. And in fact, we are taking the negative off again here. And some beautiful detail you could see, and you can also see the wonderful texture of the paper that comes through. And once the water hits the image, hits the paper, I think it's a very beautiful process. You can see the image slowly appearing, and it also seemed as though the image was gaining sharpness and contrast as we were washing it. Another thing that's very important to note here is that the higher the contrast of the image, the better the result probably is. Also, the colors that you might use in the photography matter a lot. For example, a red dress would come out quite dark, so it's best to use bright colors and create a contrast with the background. After this was done, we hung up the prints again to dry. Overall, we thought it was a wonderful experiment to revive the technique of cyanotype printing. Photography is used in order to create a negative, and hence a paper is used to print this image using a simple mixture of chemicals that reacts to light. It is quite incredible to think of these pieces as unique pieces of art. Not one would be the same as the other.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed our trip down memory lane looking at Linley Sambourne's fantastic photography, and I really would like to delve more into the archive.
I hope you enjoyed joining us for experimenting with cyanotype as well as exploring the large archive that Linley has to offer. And do visit Sambourne House in order to explore more of the wonderful drawings, illustrations and also photography that Linley has worked on during his lifetime.